Imagine living in a time when your life could be taken away for something as small as picking up a stick of wood, singing the wrong song, or wearing clothes the wrong way. History is full of bizarre, almost unbelievable laws. And while today they might make us laugh or shake our heads, in their own time, they were deadly serious. These laws weren't just about maintaining order, they were about control, fear, and keeping society exactly how those in power wanted it to be. And for the people who lived under them, even a tiny mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Let's start in medieval England, where the so-called forest laws were enforced under the rule of William the Conqueror. You might imagine these laws were about protecting the forest. But no, these rules were there to protect the king's right to hunt. If you were caught killing a deer in the royal forest, you could be blinded or executed. It didn't matter if your family was starving and you were only trying to feed them. The king's deer were untouchable, and the forests were his private playground. Peasants, who lived their entire lives near these woods, had to walk past them every day, knowing they couldn't touch a single branch without risking everything. In some cases, even carrying a bow in the forest was enough to get you killed. Travel across the world to ancient China during the Qin dynasty, and you'll find laws that make even less sense. The Emperor Qin Shi Huang, famous for uniting China and building the first version of the Great Wall, was obsessed with absolute control. One law stated that anyone who spoke badly about the government or even repeated a rumor could be executed. It wasn't just about treason, it was about silencing any voice that could challenge the emperor's image. Imagine living in a city where saying, "I think the emperor is wrong about the harvest," could have soldiers knocking on your door before sunrise. Fear wasn't just a side effect, it was the whole point. In ancient Greece, things could be just as absurd. Athens is often praised as the birthplace of democracy, but even here, some laws were brutally strange. There's a story of a man who was executed simply for cutting down an olive tree. These trees were considered sacred to the goddess Athena, and damaging one was seen as an attack on the city itself. Never mind that olive trees grew everywhere. The law treated each one like a holy relic. If you had an enemy, all you had to do was accuse them of harming an olive tree, and they could be facing the executioner before they even had time to explain themselves. Jump ahead to the 16th century in England, and you'll meet the bizarre Treason Act under Henry VIII. This law expanded the definition of treason to include speaking against the king's marriage or succession plans. If you said, "I don't think Henry should marry Anne Boleyn," that could be enough to lose your head literally. People were executed not for plotting against the crown, but for having an opinion. And Henry wasn't shy about using this law. Friends, servants, even his closest advisors found themselves at the chopping block for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. In colonial America, there were some equally shocking laws. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, run by strict Puritans, had laws that required you to attend church services every Sunday without fail. Missing church 3 times could get you severely punished, and in some cases, continued absence was seen as defying God's law, punishable by death. It's hard to imagine today, but in that time religion wasn't a private choice. It was enforced with the full power of the state. Speaking of religion, in 15th century Spain during the height of the Inquisition, blasphemy was one of the fastest ways to find yourself in mortal danger. Say something the church didn't like even as a joke and you could be arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake. People were executed over slips of the tongue or for muttering words in their sleep that someone claimed were heretical. Fear seeped into daily life. People watched their own speech so carefully, it was like living under constant surveillance. One wrong word, and you were done. But it wasn't always words or actions, sometimes appearance itself could be fatal. In 17th century Russia, Tsar Peter the Great wanted to modernize his country, and part of his vision was banning traditional longbeards. He saw them as old-fashioned and uncivilized. While most offenders were fined, in extreme cases, defying the order repeatedly could lead to severe punishment, including death. Imagine a man's entire life put at risk simply because he refused to shave. In medieval Japan, during the Tokugawa shogunate, there were strict class laws called sumptuary laws. These dictated what you could wear based on your social rank. If a farmer dared to wear silk, it wasn't just a fine, he could face execution. The idea was to keep every class in its place, and clothing became a weapon of control. A single garment could be seen as rebellion. Even games weren't safe. In 14th century France, a law was passed banning commoners from playing certain sports like real tennis. The reason? The nobility didn't want peasants getting too skilled at games they considered their own. Disobeying could bring harsh punishment, and in some areas, repeat offenses could escalate to capital punishment. Think about that, your favorite hobby could become a death sentence. And then there's one of the strangest of all, the case of sumptuary consumption laws in ancient Rome. At one point, there were rules about how much you could spend on a dinner party. If you went over the limit, you could be charged with treason against the state for being too indulgent and face execution. The Romans saw excess as a sign of moral decay, and instead of sending a tax collector, they sent soldiers. In all these examples, the line between justice and absurdity was paper-thin. These laws weren't about protecting people from real harm, they were about keeping power in the hands of the few, making sure the rulers could control every aspect of life. The threat of execution wasn't just punishment, it was a message. Step out of line, even in the smallest way, and you could disappear. And that's the scariest part, how easy it was for anyone, rich or poor, guilty or innocent, to suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the law. As time went on, the list of strange and deadly laws didn't get shorter, it just got more creative. In 18th century England, one of the most surprising execution-worthy crimes was damaging the Royal Navy's dockyards. That might sound reasonable at first. Ships were valuable, after all, but the law didn't only cover sabotage. Even accidentally causing a fire near a dockyard could lead to hanging. There's a record of a young boy being executed for knocking over a lantern, which set fire to a small storage shed. No harm came to the ships, but the law was absolute, and mercy wasn't part of the equation. The idea wasn't just to protect the Navy, it was to make an example out of anyone who dared to make a mistake near it. Travel back to ancient Egypt, and you'll find an even stranger example. Cats were sacred animals, believed to be connected to the goddess Bastet. Killing a cat, even by accident, was punishable by death. There's an account from the Greek historian Herodotus about a Roman soldier who killed a cat unintentionally and was mobbed by an angry crowd before the authorities even had to get involved. The law didn't care about intent, only the outcome. If a cat died, so might you. In medieval Europe, during the height of the witch trials, simply owning certain objects could lead to your execution. A strange-looking doll, an unusual herb, or even a book of folk remedies could be labeled as evidence of witchcraft. The law wasn't written in a clear, predictable way. Almost anything could be twisted into proof that you were in league with dark forces. People were burned at the stake for carrying lucky charms, wearing odd jewelry, or having birthmarks in suspicious places. And because fear spread faster than truth, accusations often came from personal grudges, not actual crimes. In 17th century Scotland, the laws around witchcraft took an even more bizarre turn. You could be executed not just for practicing witchcraft, but for being suspected of it by your neighbors. There was no requirement for real evidence, just the belief that you might be a witch was enough. People lived in terror of each other's suspicions. A child pointing at you in the market could lead to a trial and an early grave. In feudal Japan, during certain periods, laws known as gonengumi tied groups of 5 households together in a kind of mutual responsibility pact. If one person in the group committed a serious crime, including offenses against the shogunate, the others could be punished as well, sometimes by death. This meant your life could depend not only on your own behavior but on the actions of your neighbors. Imagine lying awake at night wondering if the man next door might do something foolish that would get your entire group killed. In 19th century Britain, before reforms, the Bloody Code listed over 200 crimes punishable by death, and some of them were shockingly petty. Stealing goods worth more than a shilling less than the price of a loaf of bread today could result in hanging. The law was designed to terrify the poor into submission, but it often did little more than fill the gallows with desperate people who had stolen out of hunger. It's one thing to punish theft, it's another to end a life over it. In ancient Sparta, discipline was everything, and disobedience during battle was seen as the ultimate disgrace. One law dictated that if you retreated from battle without orders, you could be executed. This might sound like normal military discipline, but in Sparta, the same law applied even if the retreat was the only way to save your life. Soldiers were expected to die on the battlefield rather than take a step backward without command. To them, fear of the law was meant to be greater than fear of the enemy. In the Ottoman Empire, there was a time when sultans enforced a grim and bizarre law known as fratricide. Upon taking the throne, a new sultan was allowed to have his brothers executed to prevent any challenge to his rule. This was not a hidden practice, it was openly justified as a way to maintain stability. In some cases, multiple brothers, even infants, were killed on the same day a new ruler was crowned. It's hard to imagine a law more chilling, especially when you consider that the victims had committed no crime other than being born into the wrong branch of the family. Even the arts weren't safe from deadly laws. In North Korea during the 20th century, certain musical styles were banned, and performing them could lead to execution. Music deemed inappropriate or anti-state was treated as a direct attack on the regime. Entire bands vanished overnight for playing songs that the government disapproved of. Creativity wasn't seen as self-expression, it was seen as a potential weapon. In medieval France, insulting the king could be considered lèse-majesté, an offense so serious it carried the death penalty. It didn't matter if the insult was shouted in anger or muttered in private. If someone heard it and reported you, you could be executed. An insult could mean almost anything the king didn't like. Frowning during a royal parade might be interpreted as mockery. Sometimes, the strangest part of these laws wasn't their content, but the way they were enforced. In 18th century Russia, there was a law that made it a capital offense to escape from exile in Siberia. That might not sound unusual until you realize that exile in Siberia was often a death sentence by itself due to the brutal conditions. If you stayed, you might freeze or starve. If you tried to leave, the law would have you executed. It was a no-win situation designed to crush the human spirit. The list goes on. In 15th century England, poaching fish from private ponds could get you hanged. In ancient Babylon, under Hammurabi's code, a builder whose work collapsed and killed the owner could be put to death, not just fined or imprisoned. In medieval Iceland, there was a law where if you killed someone, the victim's family could legally hunt you down and kill you in return. But if they didn't act within a set time frame, you were safe. It turned justice into a race against the clock. What's perhaps most unsettling is that in many of these societies, people accepted these laws as normal. They didn't always question the fairness or logic because to them, the law was the law. And that's the dangerous lesson history leaves us with when laws, no matter how strange, are backed by the power to kill. They shape not only how people behave, but how they think. The threat of death can make the absurd seem reasonable, at least to those trying to survive. And while many of these laws are gone, replaced by more humane systems, their stories remain as reminders of just how fragile justice can be. If you think these laws couldn't get stranger, history will gladly prove you wrong. In 14th century China, during the Ming dynasty, there was a rule that anyone who spoke ill of the emperor's dreams could face execution. Yes, dreams the kind you have while sleeping. If the emperor told you he had a vision of flying over a golden sea and you said it sounded silly, that could be your last conversation. This law came from a belief that dreams were messages from the heavens, and disrespecting them was the same as insulting divine will. Sometimes the laws were wrapped in religion, sometimes in superstition, and sometimes in sheer paranoia. In colonial America, especially in Puritan New England, certain crimes we would consider personal matters today were once capital offenses. Adultery wasn't just frowned upon, it could end with the hangman's noose. The infamous scarlet letter punishment was, in some places, the merciful alternative. Records show that in the early 1600s, a few unlucky souls met their end for breaking marriage vows, not because they threatened the community's safety, but because they defied its rigid moral code. Across the world in ancient Greece, during the rule of Draco in Athens, the laws were so harsh that they gave us the term draconian. Almost every crime, no matter how small, could be punished by death. Stealing a cabbage, death. Accidentally damaging someone's property, death. Draco's philosophy was simple. Severe punishment for all would scare people into obedience. Of course, it scared them, but it also built a legacy as one of the most unforgiving legal systems in history. Sometimes, execution wasn't just about crime, it was about control. In medieval China, there was a law under certain emperors that made it a capital offense to criticize imperial policies. Even in private letters, messengers could be bribed, intercepted, or coerced into revealing the contents of a note. This meant that even your own handwriting could sign your death warrant. In many cases, families would burn correspondence as soon as it was read, fearing that even a scrap of paper could be used as evidence. In ancient Rome, the Emperor Tiberius took things to another level. Under his reign, laws against treason expanded so broadly that almost anything could count. Wearing certain colors without permission, buying a house that overlooked the palace, or even owning a statue that looked too regal could be interpreted as a threat to the emperor's dignity. Citizens lived in fear of being accused of majestas, the crime of diminishing the emperor's greatness, a vague charge that was almost impossible to defend against. Even animals sometimes found themselves caught in deadly laws. In medieval Switzerland, there are documented cases of animals, particularly pigs, being put on trial and sentenced to death for killing humans. These trials followed all the formalities: judges, witnesses, even legal representation for the animal. Of course, the verdict was almost always guilty, and the punishment was execution. The reasoning was partly symbolic. The community believed that justice had to be done, even if the criminal had 4 legs. In 16th century England, during the reign of Henry VIII, there was a grimly practical law for counterfeiters. If you were caught making fake coins, you weren't just executed, you were boiled alive. This wasn't done in secret. It was a public event, meant to horrify onlookers into never trying the same thing. The boiling pot replaced the traditional gallows for coin forgers, sending a very literal message about the consequences of trying to fake royal currency. In the Aztec Empire, some laws were intertwined with their religious beliefs. One of the more shocking rules was that if a soldier captured in battle managed to escape before being sacrificed, the priest responsible could be executed for failing in his duty. It was a society where law, war, and religion blended seamlessly, and failure in one was considered a crime against all. The Middle Ages also gave us the bizarre practice of trial by ordeal tests, so dangerous that surviving was seen as divine proof of innocence. One variation was the ordeal of water, where the accused would be thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty and executed. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned before anyone could pull them out. It wasn't written as a death sentence, but the outcome was often the same. In 17th century Russia, Tsar Peter the Great introduced a law targeting soldiers who deserted the army. Desertion itself was already punishable by death, but Peter added a new twist. If you didn't report a deserter, you could also be executed. This created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion, where soldiers were as afraid of each other as they were of the enemy. Loyalty to the state outweighed loyalty to friends or family. Some of the strangest laws came from smaller, isolated kingdoms where rulers could enforce their will without question. In the Polynesian kingdom of Tonga, during certain periods, it was a capital crime to touch the king's possessions or even let your shadow fall across them. The belief was that the king's mana, his spiritual power, could be disrupted by contact, and such disrespect demanded the ultimate punishment. In the 18th century, a strange law emerged in Denmark-Norway during a period of strict Lutheran control. If you mocked or imitated a priest during a sermon, you could be executed. It sounds absurd, but to the authorities, it was an attack on both religion and the state. Even a whisper, a cough, or a facial expression that seemed disrespectful could be reported and punished. Not all these deadly laws came from ancient or medieval times. In the early 20th century, under Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union, a law called Article 58 made almost anything a potential act of counter-revolution. Owning foreign books, telling jokes about the government, or even failing to meet work quotas could be deemed sabotage. Millions were sent to labor camps, and countless others were executed, all under the banner of protecting the revolution. Sometimes, the law wasn't written down at all, but everyone knew it existed. In certain parts of the world, rulers maintained unspoken laws. Actions everyone understood could lead to execution without trial. In these cases, the unpredictability was the point. Fear worked best when it wasn't bound by rules. Looking back, the sheer variety of these laws shows how easily justice can be twisted into something unrecognizable. Whether they were meant to protect leaders, preserve tradition, enforce morality, or simply instill fear, they all had one thing in common: the willingness to end a life over something that, today, might not even be considered a crime. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is this: centuries from now, people might look back at some of our modern laws with the same mix of disbelief and horror. History has a way of turning today's normal into tomorrow's absurd. The lesson, then, is not just to remember these strange laws, but to question the ones we live under now, before they, too, become dark curiosities in the pages of history.